Title: 3 Horrifying True Diner Horror Stories. It was a rainy evening when Mark decided to stop by an old diner he'd passed by countless times. It wasn't on the main road, hidden away down a side street, but its neon sign flickered just enough to catch his eye. He had always been curious, and on this particular night, he was starving. As soon as Mark entered, a chill ran down his spine. The diner had an eerie, old-fashioned charm, like it had been frozen in time. The booths were cracked, the lights dim, and the smell of old grease lingered in the air. But it wasn't the condition of the diner that bothered Mark, it was the fact that it was completely empty, except for a single waitress. She stood behind the counter, her uniform neat, her hair tied in a perfect bun. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her smile felt off. "Welcome," she said in a monotone voice, "have a seat wherever you like." Mark took a booth by the window, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling creeping up his spine. The rain continued to pour outside, the drops hitting the glass like tiny fingers tapping. The waitress handed him a menu, her movements slow and robotic. As he opened the menu, he realized something strange: there were no prices listed. "Just give me a burger and fries," Mark said, trying to be polite. The waitress nodded and disappeared into the back. As he waited, Mark noticed something even stranger. The diner's clock was stuck at 3:15. He glanced at his phone, 6:45 p.m. Time seemed to be frozen inside the diner, just like everything else. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, and Mark began to grow impatient. Just as he was about to get up and leave, the waitress returned, carrying his food. Her face remained expressionless as she set the plate down in front of him. Mark took a bite of the burger, and immediately, he felt something hard between his teeth. He spit it out, horrified to find a shard of glass embedded in the patty. His stomach turned, and he pushed the plate away, standing up to leave. "Is everything all right?" the waitress asked, her voice flat and cold. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, bored into him. "No, I'm leaving," Mark stammered, reaching for his wallet. But the waitress blocked his path. "You haven't paid," she whispered, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. Before Mark could respond, the lights in the diner flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the diner was full. But the patrons weren't normal, each one was pale, with hollow eyes and blank expressions. They stared at Mark, their heads slowly turning in unison, their lifeless eyes tracking his every move. Terrified, Mark ran for the door, but as he reached for the handle, the waitress grabbed his arm. Her skin was ice cold, and her grip was like iron. "You can never leave," she whispered. "This diner, it's where we all stay. Forever." Mark wrenched himself free and bolted into the rain, never looking back. He never saw that diner again. Some say it only appears to those who are meant to stay trapped inside, forever. Jake was a long-haul trucker, used to driving through the night. He had seen his fair share of strange things on the road, but nothing compared to what happened at the Midnight Diner. It was located in the middle of nowhere, a small, run-down place that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Jake had been driving for hours and needed a break. When he saw the flickering neon sign that read, "Midnight Diner," he decided to pull over. The parking lot was empty, and the diner looked deserted, but the lights were on, and Jake was too tired to care. As he walked inside, the door creaked loudly, and the musty smell of old food hit him. The diner was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the low hum of the neon lights. A waitress, much older than any he'd ever seen, stood behind the counter, staring at him with an unsettling smile. "Have a seat, hon," she croaked, her voice like sandpaper. Jake nodded and sat down at the counter, feeling uneasy. He looked around. The diner seemed frozen in time, with an old jukebox in the corner that looked like it hadn't played music in years. The booths were covered in dust, and there were no other customers, just Jake and the waitress. "What'll it be?" she asked, sliding a menu in front of him. The menu was worn, the edges frayed, and the items listed seemed odd. Blood pudding special, graveyard stew, and midnight burger stood out, but Jake assumed it was just a joke. "I'll have a coffee and a burger," Jake said, his voice shaky. The waitress gave him a toothy grin and shuffled off to the kitchen. As he waited, Jake noticed something strange in the reflection of the diner's windows. Behind him, at one of the booths, was a shadowy figure, someone or something sitting there, watching him. Jake turned around quickly, but the booth was empty. He shook his head, chalking it up to exhaustion. Moments later, the waitress returned with his coffee, her smile never fading. But when Jake took a sip, he immediately spit it out. The coffee was ice cold, and the taste was bitter, like something had spoiled inside. "I'll pass on the coffee," Jake muttered, pushing the cup away. "That's fine," the waitress replied, her voice suddenly low and menacing. "Your food will be ready soon." As the minutes dragged on, Jake grew more and more uneasy. The shadow in the booth seemed to appear and disappear in the corner of his eye, and the diner's lights began to flicker. Finally, the waitress returned with his burger. But as soon as Jake looked down at the plate, his stomach churned. The meat was raw, the patty still bloody, and something inside the bun was moving, squirming. Horrified, Jake stood up, throwing some cash on the counter. "I'm outta here," he said, his heart racing. The waitress smiled wider than ever. "No one ever leaves the midnight diner," she whispered. As Jake ran for the door, he glanced back one last time. The shadowy figure in the booth had taken shape. It was a man, or what was left of one, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He was grinning at Jake, a twisted, sinister grin. Jake never stopped driving that night, and he never found the midnight diner again. But sometimes, late at night, he swore he could still taste the bitter, cold coffee. Maya had been working at a 24-hour diner for about 6 months. It wasn't the best job, but the tips were decent, and the night shift was usually quiet. But one night changed everything. It started like any other slow evening. Maya was cleaning tables when a man walked in, drenched from the rain. He didn't look like the usual late-night crowd, something about him was off. The man sat at the counter, his eyes darting around the room as if he were expecting someone. Maya approached cautiously. "Can I get you something?" she asked. He didn't respond at first, just stared at the menu. Finally, he muttered, "Coffee. Black." Maya nodded and poured him a cup. As the man sipped his coffee, he kept glancing out the window. Maya noticed his hands were shaking, his knuckles white as he gripped the mug. "You okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. The man looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," he whispered. "Who?" Maya asked, her heart skipping a beat. Before he could answer, the diner's front door flew open. 2 men, dressed in dark clothes, stormed inside. They didn't look at Maya, they were focused entirely on the man at the counter. Without a word, they grabbed him, pulling him from his seat. "Please," the man begged, "don't take me back." Maya stood frozen, unsure of what to do. She wanted to help, but the fear in the man's eyes told her this was something far bigger than her. The men dragged the terrified customer out of the diner and into the night. Maya rushed to the window, but as soon as she looked outside, the parking lot was empty. No car, no men, no sign of anyone. Shaken, Maya locked the door and called the police. But when they arrived, they found nothing, no sign of struggle, no evidence anyone had been there. The man had simply vanished. Maya quit the diner the next day, unable to shake the feeling that something dark had happened that night. To this day, she still wonders who that man was running from, and what happened to him after he left. These stories remind us that not everything is as it seems. Sometimes, even the most ordinary places can hide the darkest secrets. Be cautious, trust your instincts, and never ignore the feeling that something isn't right. The world is full of mysteries, and not all of them have happy endings.